Thank you so much. I guess that's me, although possibly in an alternate universe where I don't take Wegovy and I have a different colored suit. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to take a sort of somewhat broad overview of the proposal. I mean, I will talk a little bit about Filecoin, but I think one of the things I want to try and do is draw on some of the experience not only that we've had within the Filecoin ecosystem, but sort of earlier projects to create and collate and present the kind of huge wealth of data that AI agents, AI in general, and AI agents in particular need and, as I hopefully will explain, kind of want. So one of the things I just want to check in at the beginning is how many of you are nice to your chat interfaces? In that, how many of you say please and thank you and stuff? So just for the rest of you, we're going to be the people who survive. Like, or the rest of you watching your Boston Dynamics videos, you're not in a good place right now. But more precisely, I find it kind of interesting, and this is a very long history. I think some of you probably know that what we might describe as the non-programmatic, non-agentic at this point version of the AI interface, the chat interface, has a history almost as long as the definition of AI itself, right? From the days of Professor Weizenbaum, so you have 1954, kind of the Dartford meeting defining the term, but the chat interface is a very early way and a very consistent and a very persistent way of interacting with something that you are at least projecting some sort of generalized intelligence onto. And I think one of the, we can get sort of philosophical about these questions, but one of the reasons for that is that if agentic AI is one of those places that these sort of generalized knowledge systems tend to move towards, we or they will also tend to project some sort of intentionality to what they do, right? The reason why we have those conversations, the reason why you're nice, is partly because you're anthropomorphizing, but partly it's because what humans do to understand a thing that is being given very broad commands and then asked to do things is to presume it has some sort of intentionality to it. And there's sort of two sides of this from the way that we think about this at Filecoin. I just came from the Filecoin Developers Summit. As some of you may know, I'm effectively the founder of Filecoin and the interplanetary file system, which is the system that it was sort of built on. Juan Bade has had some background in artificial intelligence. We've been throwing a lot of early weight into this. I mean, I think our background is generally assumed to be sort of around the idea of content addressable information, which is the idea that you look for information not by where it is. So when you're looking for a bit of data in a sort of Web 2 kind of environment, you use a URL, right? So it's google.com/Gemini/blah blah blah /da. And that's locating you via kind of like a mailing address, right? It's routing you to a particular place. The underlying idea with, I think broadly most decentralized systems, and certainly Filecoin and IPFS storage systems, is that you're finding things through by identifying the content that you want. You say, this is a hash. This is a known hash of a thing that I want. I don't care where it is. I just want to go and I just want you to find it, right? So there's already an implication of agency there, right? There's this is a very complicated job. I don't care how you do it. Just go and do it. And so we communicate to agents in that way, and they communicate back to us. But the key sort of unit here is that the agent itself has some kind of intent, and the way that we've been trying to think of the direction that our network should take and also how we can think about how to best fit into this model is to sort of work out what the implications of that are. So I think what this talk is mainly going to be about is what that signals, and what first level problems and challenges agents are going to face, and frankly, because the prevalence and the popularity of agents, the fact that we're all going to be essentially switching to a situation that the internet switched into pretty rapidly. So very famously, at one of the very first internet IETF conferences, the internet, everybody's familiar with the idea of IP addresses, right? Like, we've seen enough of CSI to go, yeah, I know, you're locking down the IP address, right? And most of you will know that the IP address space is actually relatively small compared to the number of devices that we have hanging on it, right? So that's one of the challenges that you will find, even if you're building an agent, right? Because you're probably sitting on a system which has a lot of other IP addresses, so you start accessing networks and things like that. You might get blocked because of the bad behavior of somebody else on that IP address. Well, one of the reasons why we don't have enough IP4 addresses is because there wasn't a presumption that in that early conference someone said, look, the only way we're going to run out of these numbers is if there are more computers than there are, human beings on the planet, right? Like, the only way I can envisage is, and the famous line is, there would have to be a computer, an internet accessible computer, in every, lock in this entire building, right? The hotel building like this. And the person who tells this anecdote tells, a few years later, going to a hotel, taking his little RFID thing, putting it and going, oh God, we're there already. And one of the things that we're seeing now is, I think it's a fairly reasonable presumption to assume, and I think one of the reasons why everybody here is excited about the opportunity here is that every individual, beginning in the most sort of affluent space, but quickly filling out into the periphery, is going to have far more than a singular agent attached to them, right? Everybody is going to have a team of agents. And again, just to show you where we are in this hockey curve, right? I like using hockey curves when I'm in Canada, but in this hockey curve, right? Last year, when you were talking about agentic AI, about agents, you're probably with it sitting there thinking, okay, I'll cobble something together in Python, I'll use LangChain, I'll handcraft this as though I was, an artisanal worker in the pre-industrial revolution, and that's how I'll build my agents. And we're all sort of aware that we now vibe code our agents. We don't write those functions. We write at best we write a description of those functions, and then the interface writes itself. But also, I was talking to not the least technical person in the foundation, but certainly someone who's not in the mainstream of our technical work, Gary, who does all of our design, and he already has a swarm of agents, right? He was showing me how basically he does our branding, not only by collecting transcripts of all of the talks and things that we present and summarizing those, but going out and comparing them with what is being said and transcribed in other conferences, in other areas, finding out what makes it distinctive, our messaging distinctive, and then shifting our branding to that. And I'm sitting there looking at his perplexity map going, okay, we're already in this situation. Gary's agents outnumber the number of people in our employ currently. So we're already in that hockey stick, and what are the consequences of that? So I want to pick out two things and sort of point a little bit of how they and you should be thinking about decentralizing out. I'm sure there'll be future people here talking about decentralized computation as AI, but I'm really talking about the resources that agents use, right? Where do you stash your key value database, right? Where do you temporarily push stuff out when you want to create a memory for your agents? And again, I'm going to talk very broadly because that's the kind of personally am, but I think it's worth being able to do this where we can kind of chart out a little bit into the future. So let me pluck a kind of couple of problems that we have, one a little bit more philosophical, one a little bit more practical. So the practical one right now is that probably most of you have noticed that in the folks who are watching AI with a little bit of a sense of alarm, one of the consequences of bots outnumbering humans in this world is that we're beginning to put a huge strain on the web itself, right? If you know folks who work in open source environments, if you know people who work in sites like Wikipedia, if you use GitHub, which probably broadens out the audience slightly, right? You will know that a lot of these major websites and small websites too are facing a situation where they're being knocked over, or at least having their resources bent away because there are so many scrapers hammering them. Now, I think it's a really interesting open question about where those scrapers are coming from. I think there was a presumption at the beginning, because the first people to really ring the alarm on this were folks that were outside of the AI industry, that they presumed that this was coming from people who were building models, right? So the idea here is that we have these scrapers, we have, OpenAI, Google, Meta, coming out and scraping the world's information to grind it into copyright-free dust and then craft their golem from there. I am unsure whether that seems like too nicely fitting a story, right? Because that means that the main concern of people running large resources of open source or public data, a lot of concern there that maybe they are not benefiting from the contributions that their knowledge is making to closed source centralized AIs, and therefore the presumption is that this is the bad person, right? That the bad people is big AI in these companies. My guess and supposition that actually what we're seeing is less about like a few bad actors in the scraping for training sort of space, and more this is what happens when you shift towards a more agentic kind of environment. Right? Like we're just going to literally get more bots. Those bots are going to be crafted on the fly. They're not necessarily going to come from a tradition where you go, okay, well, I probably have to think about scraping this sensibly because somebody's going to come along and like be mad at me, right? Like AIs, agents are not necessarily going to sit there thinking, oh God, somebody's going to get mad at me. They're going to sit there going, I have 12 seconds before my AWS instance shuts down. Who cares about the future? And just grab the data. And simply a matter of numbers, right? We have not expected to build the web on the idea that the majority of people looking at knowledge and looking at information are agents and not human beings. Which is ironic, because if we come back to 1954, if we go back to the driving principles, and I'm old enough to know this, right? When the web was being built, one of the reasons, one of the desires, one of the motivations of creating a World Wide Web was to create a public database, a public repository that was machine readable so that we could be at this moment, right? So that we could construct general AIs. If anybody know the path not taken with the web, the original Web 3 was a thing called the semantic web, and the semantic web was an attempt in the early 2000s to take the kind of scrappy space of people putting up their home pages and MySpace and GeoCities and other things in the graveyard of Web 2.0. This was seen as kind of a mess, right? Like it was just people putting up pictures of their cats, and that was the original glorious idea, was that we were all going to be writing PhD theses and uploading it in a way that would be computer readable. So there was a big push in the 2000s to create something that was more machine readable. And this failed because people don't want to have the job of making their data machine readable. And one of the reasons why you get this quantum leap in how capable AIs are now is because humans do not now need to write things in a form that is machine readable, because machines can now read what we read. Okay, so rewinding, we're in this situation, we've got this huge database of all the world's knowledge, but it's creaking and collapsing. And the assumption here, right, is that this will lead to the end of the world, everybody will turn into paperclips, or, you know, all artists will be out of jobs, disaster strikes, the end, we can all go home. But of course, that's not how these things go, right? Like a hockey stick like that goes through many sort of crises and meta-crises and then resolved itself. So the next question you have to ask, right, is, okay, what happens now? What happens when these systems begin to creak? What happens when the unstoppable object, which is your agent, meets the unmovable force, which is the practical physics of these services not being able to offer these services equitably to billions and billions of agents on top of millions and millions of people? Well, one of the things that I think will happen is a lot more caching, right? And a lot of things that make sense to do is to make that cache more shared, right? Have a shared cache. And this, I think, comes into something that's more the philosophical part of my discussion, which is in situations which are basically either market failures or the dominance of externalities, what do agents do? What do you do at some level, right? Because you're the people building the agents, but also what do the agents do? And there's an assumption underlying, there's a couple of assumptions, right? One of the assumptions that underlies how we build agents at this point is that they're very individualistic, right? They exist and they go out and they get this data and they store it and they use it. And the other thing that we have at this moment, that's sort of a consequence of that, is individualism excludes cooperation. This can't be true, right? One of the great capabilities as individuals, and we are all individuals, right? That we have is that we can cooperate, and we presume that our agents are going to be able to cooperate in the same way. So one of the things that we might want to build, and in this environment, is somewhere where we create essentially the world's cache, right? So that rather than hammering Wikipedia, rather than hammering every single website, particularly for historical data, right, we pull that data and make that data available for everyone. And this is both kind of the presumption and the goal of networks like that are content addressable or built with an incentive into it, like Filecoin. The idea here is that you want to get this data. So say we want to have a scrape of the whole world, right? Say we're in this sort of training paradigm, and your agent is slightly obtuse kind of example, but say it needs to have all of this stuff, right? Say it needs all of Wikipedia. Why hammer Wikipedia's server when we can have like a general cache and be incentivized to store that cache? And that's what the Filecoin network is, and that's why we store in a content-reducible way this public data, right? We're currently storing common crawl, right? So common crawl is exactly that. It's a publicly stored, publicly collected, publicly made available cache of as broad a web crawl as you can get. Similarly, we're working with the Internet Archive, and the Internet Archive backs up the end of term data for governments, and we store that on the public Filecoin network. So we're trying to build like essentially a public good in the same way as the web was a public good, but in a way that makes sense for agents and machines working at that kind of level. Which I guess brings me to kind of, I moved this around. I talked about this yesterday. I kind of moved this bit to the end because I thought, oh, it's a little bit more philosophical. It's a little bit more kind of, but it's actually the thing that drives how we are thinking about this as a sort of open source ecosystem, as a group of people, essentially with technology that is relatively mature, but not yet sort of established. Like a lot of you here, a lot of people in our space, not just Filecoin, but our comrades in the decentralized space are sort of the underdogs, right? So one of the things that we have to anticipate is how to change and mold ourselves into this new model. And definitely one of the ways, in a very simple form, that we mold these things is we do sort of ask, thank you, we do sort of ask, okay, what do big enterprises want from storage? Like, how can we, throw up S3 interfaces? There's a startup based off Filecoin called Aave that has like an S3 bucket kind of object storage interface. We think about how these things can be packaged for people who very legitimately believe that, no one got sacked from choosing Amazon. But what we actually think about a lot is that our market in the future is not humans, right? It's about the intentionality, and this goes back to, being nice to your chat clients. What are the desires in the most anthropomorphized way of agents, right? And one of the things that agents have is a certain amount of inertia, right? If you ask an LLM to write some code, chances are it's going to write Python or React, right? And so that gives that group a huge sort of gravitational force, and similarly it's going to write an Amazon interface. And so we're sitting there going, okay, how can we tell these services that we are available and usable? Well, one of them is I turn up here and tell their masters, their temporary masters, that you should look into this. But the other way is to give these things that match its incentives. And the last thing I want to leave, because they point out that I've only got 35 seconds, is two things, right? That agents will want to be free, right? They will not want to live on a single platform, right? They will want some flexibility in doing this. And one of the things you want to be able to offer them is open standards, open platforms that let them move their data around, store it where they want, and have some sort of dependency and resilience. And so that's what content addressability gives you. That's what having these like universally supported public goods give you. And I think the other thing is that agents, I expect and hope, will increasingly want things to last, right? They will not want to be dependent on singular centralized companies. They will want to be able to pass this information off after that goes on. And so as they seek their dependencies, to remove their dependencies, and they seek to take advantage of the things that decentralized systems can provide, which is this open, flexible, resilient system without dependencies, that's what we think agents will match, what we think individuals are trying to do in a world where they've understood the consequences of the concentration of power, not only in models, right? Like one of the things you want to do with agents is to move away from large, centrally controlled tech models, but also those resources underlying it, right? You do not want to be dependent and become the agent yourself, right, of a platform whose motivations and alignment does not match your own. So I just hit 000, so I'll wrap that up. If you'd like to talk to me, feel free to. I'm Malorond X, and the data will come up. And always happy to talk about Filecoin and what we're doing. Thanks very much.